So beyond the cool kid, you sort of describe the cool kid as like maybe one standard deviation above the mean in terms of like their aesthetic assertions, and then beyond that, at 2 to 3 standard deviations is maybe the hipster. So can you tell us about hipster theoretic art and art as a Schelling point creation?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that would be like model three. So
Mhm.
yeah, basically like I mean like the I guess like the equivalent. I don't know if this metaphor lands on people, but it somehow like it points at the thing in my head a little bit, which is like the difference between geeks and nerds. And like
Mhm.
geeks kind of like they love things such as like Marvel movies and like superhero things, and it's more about like the aesthetic of science rather than science itself.
Okay, yeah.
Whereas like nerds actually just care about like the truth of the matter. They'll read a physics textbook whether or not they can show off to others about it. um, it's just kind of like a geek is more optimizing for like showing off to others like their aesthetic, whereas a nerd intrinsically cares about truth.
Hmm.
And likewise in the world of art, I would say a cool kid is kind of a geek in the sense like, yeah, they will have like specialized interests, but it always comes down to how can I show off to the general population? How can I get like millions of followers? Whereas the hipster is just like genuinely fascinated by a very specific aspect. I mean, it could be, for example, reverb. You could have a hipster that like all they spend their waking hours on is like fine tuning reverb models to create
Hmm.
interesting sounds. And that's that's their main thing. And of course, you can stitch together the work of several hipsters into something very consumable. But on its own, like a hipster will generally not be producing like a mega hit for for that reason.
Hmm.
But they are almost certainly pushing the boundary of like what has been explored. And in that sense, I think like hipsters as well as nerds are like very valuable. It's just a matter of like recognizing them and kind of nurturing them, pointing them at something useful. And I guess a note here is that hipsters in the early 2010s, there was kind of this whole thing of like, oh, everybody's becoming a hipster. And I would actually say that like at that time, where you would have like people in coffee shops with a typing machine and like old
Yeah.
bicycles um, uh, and people playing like weird instruments in public, and like all of that I actually would associate more with like cool kids started
That's what
using the
I, yeah.
hipster aesthetic. Yeah. So because then again it's like, okay, yeah, something like hipsterism itself became an aesthetic, and then cool kids were competing to show how much of a hipster they were. But I would say they were not true hipsters. Like the true hipsters don't actually care what others think of them.
Hmm. So this makes me think of like the Schelling point element of this makes me think of like Brian Eno's idea of scenius, kind of like the genius of the scene. And so when you have all these hipsters or like these sort of artistic fringe people coming together, there's maybe a synergy and some sort of emergence. Does that sort of mesh with what you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely. Um, it's yeah, there will be, yeah, definitely kind of the core of an artistic, like a generally new artistic movement or aesthetic. And um yeah, I mean it's just a matter of like making sure the hipster to cool kid ratio is properly balanced. You don't have too many cool kids.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned like minimax strategies, and I'm not sure if I fully understand that idea, but it made me think of like Paul Erdős and his sort of like complete asymmetry of capabilities. Like he's this prolific mathematician, but he was, completely incapable of other parts of his life. Is that sort of a truth hipster or like a nerd, and the hipster is just the aesthetic version of that?
Yeah, definitely. It's yeah, I mean definitely on like game metaphors, uh like when you're talking about, for example, like a tank, in a video game. It's like, okay, this character that specializes on just being very resistant, and like it's so resistant that like resistant to damage that like even if it has like weak attack and like weak agility, it still doesn't matter because in many contexts like that will like be enough. as opposed to like a well-rounded character. And I mean, the truth of the matter is that in real life, a lot of the times, like minimaxing is a really good strategy. And I guess like minimaxing is defined as putting all of your points in just a narrow like set of skills and just like 0 points into everything else because you just want to maximize that. And it does seem to be like in many skills, for example, there's kind of a you need a threshold of ability before you actually get to do interesting things. In which case, like, you know, just spreading your abilities across the board doesn't even allow you to do anything interesting with anything, right? And I think like that's definitely a risk. I would also relate it to like, yeah, like tech jobs. You have like, you know, full stack engineers, obviously very important. But then you might have like a person who's like a super good, you know, extra specialist on like, you know, C or C#. And like whenever you have a problem with C#, that person will solve it. And it's good to have people around that way as well.
Gotcha. Cool.
And I guess in evolution, just like a last example is things such as insane things like the piston shrimp, for example, where like they have like this weird contraction that like in their claws, they click in a certain way that it creates a cavitation bubble and basically knocks out anybody around them. And you know, it's like one of those things that like it's kind of a discontinuity if you can do it with certain force below the threshold, it just does nothing. But if you can reach a cavitation bubble, then actually just has this massive effect. Yeah, I would recommend anybody in the audience to Google piston shrimp and like watching a short video about it. But it's, yeah, I mean, in evolution, you have a lot of animals who like basically just specialize in having one big trick, and like they use that trick for everything.